Thank you all for having me today, and I'm excited. I'm excited because I get to tell you some of the stuff that I'm working on for my degree right now, but I'm studying C.S. Lewis and the worldview that I think he wants you to have, all right? And when I say worldview, don't hear some ideas about just how we should all get along. I mean, think about a world image, okay? The picture that he wants you to have in your head when you close your eyes. Okay, I want to begin by just sharing with you an excerpt from Out of the Silent Planet, which sets the stage for us. In Out of the Silent Planet, Dr. Ransom, he's the protagonist of the story. He finds himself kidnapped. He's being taken out into the cold, black vacuity of space, right, on this spaceship. And he reflects this way. We read this. He says, he had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it had affected him until now. Now the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for the empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly upon the earth with so many eyes, and here with how many more? No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declare the glory. And Out of the Silent Planet, what you find is this is a story about a man who's coming face to face with his image of reality being totally reimagined, right? Everything he thought he knew, it turns out to be wrong. And this is very similar to Lewis's story personally. In the introduction to his book, The Problem of Pain, Lewis says this about himself. He says, not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, why do you not believe in God? My reply would have been something like this. Look at the universe we live in. By far, the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. He goes on to trace how the universe appeared to him to be not only without life, but anti-life. He says every species survives by preying upon one another, and that ultimately the most complex life form, humanity, they foresee their own doom, right, which causes all this mental suffering, while we desire permanence, okay? And the truth is, today, most of us hold, at least to some level, of a similar worldview. And this is what I mean. If I said, close your eyes right now, and I said the word nature, right? What images come to mind? And I don't have time to do this with everyone today. I apologize, okay? But in my experience, what people will generally say is something like rocks and birds and trees and things like that, right? Natural phenomena, things you can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Some people might take it a step further, and they might say images like space. They'll say, actually, I see planets and that black background of space covered by burning balls of gas in some picture I've seen, and that's the image they have. But in either case, the image can be summed up like this. Life, as we know it, is found right here on earth. Everything else is dead, cold blackness. Yet, in 1954, when Lewis was taking the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge, he wrote an inaugural address called Descriptione Temporum, and he claims to be in that essay a man of the old Western world. He calls himself a dinosaur. He says, and the dinosaurs are passing away. There's not going to be many more of us left. But in the essay, what he says is there's been this shift. There's been this shift in the way people see the world. They have that image at the back of their mind, and it's changed from an old archetypal image to a new archetypal image. All right, and we may think, what is that old archetypal image, and why would this be so influential to Lewis? I want to begin by painting a picture for you of the world that C.S. Lewis lived in, studying medieval and Renaissance literature and their worldview. And I'm going to quote Michael Ward here from his book Planet Narnia, but he gives us, I think, a helpful picture. He says, it would be like looking at a vast lighted concavity, quote, in the nearest part of the sky, our eyes would have seen, or rather seen through, the transparent sphere in which the planet Luna, that's the moon, revolves. then the larger spheres of Mercury, then the still larger one of Venus, and so on through the spheres of Sol, that's the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each sphere rotating more rapidly than the last and each exerting a peculiar influence upon mundane people and events. Beyond Saturn's sphere, we would have seen the heavens of the fixed stars, the stellatum. And beyond that, the primum mobile, the spheres which conveys movement to all the other lower spheres. Further, from the primum mobile, we would not have been able to see, for that would have taken us outside of sight, outside of the created order, into the empyrean, that same language that was used in Ransom's quote earlier, the very home of God and the elect. And so what Ward's setting up for us here is this image that Lewis was swimming in all this literature. And I want you to imagine yourself what it would be like. You're a person of the medieval world or the ancient world, and you find yourself standing on the ground at night, pray say, and you look up in the sky, and what do you see? You see bodies, planetary bodies and stars, and they are moving consistently in patterns, in order, in consistency, right? Night after night, day after day, season after season. And what you see around you is the opposite in many ways. You find disorder, inconstancy, right? The inability to keep your world under control. And so what you're really doing is you're looking up at a tower-like structure that ascends in dignity and authority towards the realm of God. Up there is where God and authority and consistency is truly found, and down here on earth, well, this is the edge of the map, all right? And so Lewis found this to be a profoundly philosophically consistent worldview where God exists outside of space and time, beyond the farthest sphere out there, beyond that which we can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear. And what we can see in these two images thus far is that we have moved from the tower-like structure of the medieval model that ranked in purity and light and perfection to one in which life itself is only found here. We are the only source of life and light in an ever-dark universe, okay? Now, we might think in our modern world, well, of course, we have this new model because that's what we found out, right? Through our telescopes, through our study of the stars. But Lewis contends that actually much of what we think we know about the medieval model is inaccurate. And actually, much of the medieval model could still apply in the modern day. He offers two things that modern people think about the old model. And I think this applies to many people today. People often think that if you are a person of the old Western image, you believe two things to be true. One, you believe that the earth was central to their cosmology, and the sun and everything rotated around it because they had this anthropocentric view where humanity was the most important. And two, they believed that the earth was flat. And Lewis says that that's stupid, all right? Frankly, he says it's stupid, right? Actually, if you go back and read ancient literature, it's nowhere in there. He offers a couple places. In Miracles, Lewis states, more than 1,700 years ago, Ptolemy taught that in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, the whole earth must be regarded as a point with no magnitude. His astronomical system was universally accepted in the Dark and Middle Ages. And he goes on, in English literature, in the 16th century, excluding drama, Lewis states, for ages, men had believed the earth to be a sphere. Men had believed the earth to be a sphere, nor was it generally felt that the earth or man would lose dignity by being shifted from the cosmic center. The central position had not implied preeminence. The position which was locally central was dynamically marginal. In other words, the shape of the planet and the vastness of our solar system, they're not new discoveries. The only revolution is us beginning to think that they are new discoveries, right? And so in this way, Lewis says that the old image was not refuted by the telescope. What Lewis goes on to talk about in much of his writing is actually the significance of what the new model has done to the way we see the world and in fact see each other. And while I don't have time to go over all that deeply today, I want to kind of give a summary statement of it, all right? Functionally, it's this. The laws of nature and nature itself cannot explain itself, nor the constant it represents. In Miracles, Lewis says this, and then I'll try to explain this, but he says, every law can be reduced to the form if A, then B. Laws give us only a universe of ifs and ands, not the universe which actually exists. What we know through laws and general principles is a series of connections, but in order for there to be a real universe, the connections must be given something to connect. A torrent of opaque actualities, And if God is created the world, then he is precisely the source of this torrent, and it alone gives our truest principles anything to be true about. But if God is the ultimate source of all concrete individual things and events, then God himself must be concrete. And I want you to remember that word concrete, because I think it's significant for Lewis. But basically, Lewis says that, look, if God exists, he must be the most real thing in reality. He is the thing from which all other things sprang. So while our sensory data indicates a fixed outer world, it actually tells us nothing about the origin of that fixed outer world or the source of its sustenance, why the world's still here, right? Or if there's anything beyond our sensory data. And Lewis basically says, look, he refers to that concrete constant as God, as the center, or in miracles, even specifically as Christ. He says, in the New Testament, the Son is identified with the discourse or reason or word, which was eternally with God, and yet also was God. He is the all-pervasive principle of concretion or cohesion, whereby the universe holds together. All things, and especially life, arose within him. And within him, all things will reach their conclusion, the final statement of what they've been trying to express. And earlier in Miracles, he basically says it this way. Supernaturalists and naturalists agree that there must be something that exists on its own, right? And naturalists will say it's just what we can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear. We don't have a reason for that necessarily, but that's the faith position they hold. On the other side, he says supernaturalists say there's two things. There's derivative things, which are secondary things, and then there must be a first thing from which everything else sprang. And that's God, that's Christ, okay? So while scientific laws measure nature as we know it, what we can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear, it can't account for itself, nor can we assume that sensory data is actually all there is of reality. And forgive me if this thought exercise gives some of you a headache, but I find it helpful, okay? I want you to imagine how reality can exist beyond our sensory data. And so I want you to imagine for a second what it would be like to imagine all of reality as a central like elevator shaft, a building, okay, with a central elevator, and all of reality is this building, but it's a sensory elevator. So in the very basement, it's only mind. You can't see, taste, touch, smell, or hear anything, right? And I want to take you through this, right? You hear a ding, okay, and you realize, oh, I've been brought up, right? You've arrived on the first floor. You must have been in the basement. After a few moments, you hear the motor begin to pull, and seconds later, another ding. You've been brought up to the second floor, and with the arrival comes touch. You find yourself to have weight and be clothed and leaning against a wall. Then the process repeats itself. There's another ding, and you find yourself on the third floor. You find a wonderful scent in your nose. The most delicious things appear to be around you, and sure enough, with the next ding, the fourth floor comes sight. You see that you are, in fact, surrounded by many of your favorite foods, and forgetting for a moment that you can't yet taste, you dig in to a strawberry, and for a moment you're puzzled, and then another ding, the fifth floor, and all of a sudden, there it is. That's the full taste of the strawberry, right, on your tongue, and you're like, yes, this is what a strawberry is. I finally have full access to all my senses, right? And stick with me here, but for Lewis, he basically says our relationship to reality comes through sensory data a lot of the time. But we have to be given access to sensory data to understand the world as it actually is around us. And if we cut ourselves off, or we are cut off from any of those senses, we understand our world less, all right? And I'll give you an example. If I were to go down to the fourth floor, and I were to find a fourth floor neighbor who'd never tasted the strawberry, and I said, tasting a strawberry is a little bit like if you smell a strawberry, but it happens like in here, like in your mouth, right? Is that neighbor gonna really understand what it's like to taste a strawberry? No, right, not really. But they will be given the idea that perhaps there is something, and that other people may have had an experience that is beyond their own. Right? And the truth is, as we were to go down each floor, it would become increasingly harder and harder to communicate that there is a strawberry at all. On the first floor, where there's only sound, I suppose you could squash a strawberry next to someone's ear. But once again, eating a strawberry and having one squashed next to your ear hardly give you the same picture of strawberryness, right? A strawberry is only real when it comes to you through all of your senses. You only get one small part. And should you get to the basement, once again, in the basement, the strawberry is right next to you, but you are subjectively cut off from it. You have no access to the existence of the strawberry because you have no sensory data, even though reality continues to exist around you all the time, okay? Now, what we find ourselves in here is the possibility that what if there's not just 5 floors? What if there is a 6th floor, or a 7th floor, or a 100th floor, right? And now, if this is the case, then we find ourselves in the position of the 4th floor resident who cannot taste the strawberry. I would need someone to come down and explain using language and concepts I understand to help me know that there is a 6th floor, and though I will not be able to completely understand it, I can begin to believe that it exists, and that perhaps other people have been there, and that perhaps I might go there too. Now, what we've seen thus far is that there is this fixed reality. We have to be given access to it through our senses, but we can be cut off from it without it, right? But that we can start to believe through these analogies that perhaps there is higher floors, right? And the elevator, in a sense, brings us up to them. We have to be brought up. Now, when Lewis would come to faith, he would do so through coming to understand Christ as the personal, concrete reality that had acted as the fountainhead of being. He was the God who was over all of reality and was, in a sense, at the penthouse of reality. And yet he had come down to the lower floors, right? He had descended and made himself sensorially perceptible, not only so that we might know him, but so that he might ascend again and bring us back up with him into the heavenly realms, to use the language of the book of Ephesians. And as a result, once Lewis became a Christian, he consistently shows himself committed to this hierarchically ordered cosmos in which the objective causal reality, God, is revealing himself in a general way through our experiences and natural phenomena, but also in a specific way in the person of Christ, as he is not only pushed on but into material reality. It says, as the book of John tells us, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So in Christ, the fullness of God, or the causal reality, is most clearly revealed. And Lewis says this: I allow and insist that the eternal Word, the second person of the Trinity, can never be nor have been confined to any place at all. It is rather in him that all places exist. So within the hierarchical image of reality of the medieval and ancient world, Lewis saw a very philosophically and rationally consistent picture that he found compelling, where Christ is the fountainhead of concrete reality. I should say God is the fountainhead of concrete reality, and Christ is the proof of that personal reality. And as a result, I believe Lewis took the rest of his, most of the rest of his life as an author and teacher, both in fiction and nonfiction, as a storyteller, to help his audience reimagine the possibilities of the ancient world image, that of a hierarchical reality in which God was the fountainhead of being over all and through all. And so in our remaining time, I want to answer 3 questions. I want to answer who is God as concrete reality for Lewis? What does it mean to engage with God as concrete reality? And what does it mean to reject God as concrete reality? So firstly, who is God as concrete reality for Lewis? Within the Lewisian presentation of the cosmos, God, once again, as causal reality, he's uniquely present in or at the center of all created matter, and therefore it's the duty of humanity to understand its place as a derivative being. And Lewis emphasizes that this shouldn't lead us to a pantheist position. He says in Miracles that derivative things from atoms to archangels hardly attain to existence at all in comparison with their creator. Their principle of existence is not in themselves. He, God, is the opaque center of all existences, the thing that simply and entirely is the fountainhead of facthood. And this is to recognize in him a positive perfection which pantheism has obscured. The perfection of being created. He is so brimful of existence that he can give existence away, can cause things to be and to be really other than himself, can make it untrue to say that he is everything. So for Lewis, God is not only the source of substance, but he's the specific thing from which all other things became things, right? He's the individual being from whom that individuality flows. And so in the act of creation, he became the highest of beings, the reality from which all other reality found itself. And Lewis paints a picture of how God can be the fountainhead of being and yet share his being with others in the space trilogy. In Out of the Silent Planet, the main character, Ransom, He learns that there's these angelic creatures named Eldila, all right? And later, Ransom finds out he can't even really hear them. But this phenomena is eventually explained to him by a member of an alien species called a Sorn. And he basically says, look, there's this hierarchy in the universe. There's this God, this old ruling spirit, and then there's Maleldil the young, his son, is a companion fellow ruling spirit, so this should sound familiar. And under them, there's also Oyarsa, is a kind of archangel. And then and they rule each planet, and then there are Eldila, who are angels, who are working on each planet. But Ransom is confused, and he says, but what are Eldila? How can I not see them? Have they no bodies? And the Soren says, of course they have bodies. There are a great many bodies you cannot see. Every animal sees some things, but not others. And later, the Soren summarizes this, says that the Eldila are, in a sense, they're creatures who are moving faster than any humans can experience them, right? They're living in a reality that's, in a sense, faster than all other human reality, and therefore we experience their bodies differently. He says, to us, the Eldil is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself, he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like cloud. So the Eldila are, in a sense, they're this higher being in the cosmos, closer to their creator in likeness, and so to a certain degree, actually beyond our awareness. And this phenomena isn't exclusive to the space trilogy. We see something similar in Aslan, in A Horse and His Boy. Early on in the story, we see Shasta and Bree, and they're being chased by these lions on either side of them, and they can't get away. But later, Aslan, the divine character in the story, comes to Shasta and says, actually, it was me. I was both lions, right? Aslan was the multiplicity of beings present in this space. And in Miracles, once again, nonfiction work, Lewis uses very similar language to emphasize what the personal presence of God is like. He said, you might, if you wished, call it movement at an infinite speed, which is the same thing as rest. So in these images, we see a hierarchical universe founded in an ultimate being who has the ultimate ability to spread itself and be, in a sense, everywhere at once, sustaining everything at once and working for its own purposes. From here, all things find their substance via their direct connection to this infinitely agile and thus infinitely fixed substance who is the creator himself. But what does this mean for us, for you and I, all right? For many of Lewis's characters, we find that their experience of material reality is, just like the Eldila, directly tied to how close they are or in right relationship with God, right? And therefore, characters are becoming more or less like God as the fountainhead of reality in many ways, and this includes us. Once again, nonfiction. In The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis says, it's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most interesting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you'd be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or others of these destinations. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. And in this we see that humanity is in a sense becoming or aligning with one's design as intended by God or not. And that this is central to what Lewis says life is about for you and me and why it's important we see the world a certain way. So let's dive in a little bit deeper to the second question. What does it mean to reject God as concrete reality? In the final book of the Narnia series, The Last Battle, the heroes of the story, they've been in this desperate battle and they've been shoved through this door, this stable door, but something profound happens. They find themselves shoved out into the other side, and the heroes of the story, they find themselves, it's summer. They find themselves in this beautiful, open, grassy area. There's fruit trees. It's incredible. And they're surrounded by friends of Narnia from the past, and they seem to have been transported into another world. Yet what we find is that not everyone who is shoved through the stable door has the same experience. There's this group of dwarves who've been shoved through, and they were a group that was in rebellion against Narnia, against their king Tirian, and against Aslan. And their experience can be summed up this way. When asked to explain where they're at, one of the dwarves says that they are in a pitch black pokey, smelly little hole of a stable, all right? And Lucy, she comes to them and she tries to prove that, no, you're in this new world. And she takes these violets and she rubs them under one of the dwarves' nose, and he just goes, none of that, how dare you? What do you mean shoving a lot of filthy stable litter in my face, right? And in the end, Aslan comes to everyone there and he says, look, their prison is in their minds. They are so afraid of being taken in that they can't be taken out. What we see in the dwarves here is that they've been cut off from reality by choice. They will, in a sense, not allow Aslan to reach them with reality. They have reduced themselves by choice to nearly nothing when compared with their potential by design in God. And this is the temptation of all fallen beings in Lewis's works. In Out of the Silent Planet, the Sorn are confused as to why humanity has this problem in the first place. They say, look, creation is pretty natural. There has to be a hierarchy of order. There must be rule. Beasts, which are animals, must be ruled by Hnau, that's rational species, and Hnau by Eldila, angels or cosmic beings, and Eldila by Maleldil, who is God. So the problem for both the Sorn and for us then is that there is a breakdown in the chain of existence or the hierarchy of existence. But why would there be a breakdown? Why would any of us be tempted to see a break in the chain? Lewis calls this clinging, okay? This is clinging to an old good that God gave us instead of trusting him to continue to bring us good. We're given a kind of an image of this on the first day that Ransom is on the planet Paralandra. He tastes this yellow fruit and he says, it was like the discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures, something unheard of among men, out of all reckoning, beyond all covenant. For one draft of this on earth, wars would be fought and nations betrayed. Yet when he's tempted to go back for a second draft, he says, he feels this unforeseen instinct takes hold and says, don't do it, right? And he says, perhaps the experience had been so complete that a repetition of it would be a vulgarity. He has a very similar experience when he touches a bubble and it pops and it gives this just enchanting bath and he wants to go do it again. But once again, the instinct kicks in, don't do it again. And he starts to think about it. He says, actually, what if this is the root of all evil, the desire to have something over again? And he says, no, well, money is the root of all evil. But money itself, perhaps, if one values it chiefly as a defense against chance, a security for being able to have things over again, right? Then that is kind of the same thing. It's the root of all evil. It's trying to get good back on my own terms. And there's lots of other examples. I'll share a couple. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Edmund demonstrates this for us. He arrives, it's kind of this major scene. He arrives in Narnia. He meets the White Witch. She offers him anything to eat. He says he wants Turkish delight. She gives him some. And then we find out that this was enchanted Turkish delight. And that anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more, and would even, if they were allowed, go on eating it until they killed themselves. So Edmund consumes the box, and though he's satisfied while he's eating it, as soon as he finds that it's gone, he becomes consumed with receiving more. He is, in this sense, consumed with consuming. He becomes a bottomless pit of desire which longs to take its pleasure again, even if it means sacrificing others to do so, and thus he becomes a prisoner of his own desire. The same might be said of any earthly experience. This quote is from The Weight of Glory. I also have it tattooed right here, just for fun. That one's for free. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was never in them. It only came through them, and what came through them was longing, right? So we need to stop seeking desire for its own, on its own terms, for our own satisfaction. Another interesting case would be Queen Susan, right? She shows up in the early books, and we're told that once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia, and then in the last battle, we're told that Susan doesn't show up. We're told that she's no longer a friend of Narnia. And when they start digging into her story a little bit, we find out that now she's interested in nothing except nylons and lipstick and invitations. That's a quote. All right, and Lady Polly goes on, she summarizes it. She said, she wasted all of her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea is to race on to the silliest time of one's life as quick as she can, and then stop there as long as she can, all right? And what we find in Susan is that actually Narnia as a reality has completely slipped her mind. She can only remember it as a childhood fancy, but not as a reality, right? She has chosen where she longs to be, and she is clinging to that stage of life, and that is who she sees herself to be and does not wish to give it up, all right? And the truth is that we see this all over in Lewis, right? In the Screwtape Letters, for instance, Lewis presents hell as a place that's built upon clinging, upon consumption even, having a thing and consuming it over and over again. He feigns that devils can, in a spiritual sense, eat one another and us, he says. Yet he goes on, even in human life, we have seen a passion to dominate, almost to digest one's fellow. Lewis concludes that this is because it's the nature of the demonic to do so. Quote, I suggest the stronger spirit, there are perhaps no bodies to impede the operation, can really and irrevocably suck the weaker into itself and permanently gorge its own being on the weaker's outraged individuality. It is for this that Satan desires all his own followers and all the sons of Eve and all the hosts of heaven. His dream is that of the day when all shall be inside of him and all that says I can only say so through him. Lewis says this is a kind of bloated spider parody of what God has been doing and has always been doing, right? In creating creation within himself and for himself, right? In this way, hunger, the hunger that drives humanity to consume creation for its own sake, this is done because it's a mimicry of Satan, who desires to consume all of creation for his own sake. We cling because we are followers of the one who first started clinging. And the result, of course, is that humans, the more and more we consume for ourselves, the more and more we are consumed by the demonic power that fuels that longing. And we receive some examples of this. In that hideous strength, the character of Wither is an interesting case. At one point, Mark Studdock, he's one of the protagonists. He escapes from the NIC, this organization, and he just left Wither's office. And now he runs outside and he finds Wither standing in his path, and we read that he's a tall, stooped, shuffling, creaking figure humming a tune. And a very uncharacteristic moment of bravery, Mark decides, I'm going to punch, right? He tries to throw a punch at Wither, and what happens is that Wither there was no impact. The shape suddenly vanished, right? And what we start to see in the character of Wither is that Wither has actually become more phantom than human. Right? He's become less flesh and blood and more mind, but his mind is the subject of another, right? And we'll talk about that more in a second here. The fictional George MacDonald in The Great Divorce says it this way: for the damned soul is nearly nothing. It is shrunk, shut up upon itself. God beats upon the damned incessantly as sound waves beat upon the ears of the deaf, but they cannot receive it. Their fists are clenched, their teeth are clenched, their eyes fast shut. First they will not, then they cannot open their hands for gifts, for their mouths for food, or their eyes to see. And we're given a very specific example of this in the character of Uncle Andrew in The Magician's Nephew. He's kind of the evil older uncle who got them into the whole process. But what we find is that Uncle Andrew, when he finds himself in Narnia as it's being created, Aslan shows up on the scene. He's singing reality into being, but then he enters into this weird kind of self-deception. Here's a quote. When the lion had first begun singing long ago, when it was still quite dark, he had realized the noise was a song, and he had disliked the song very much. It made him think and feel things he did not want to think and feel. Then, when the sun rose, he saw that the singer was a lion. Only a lion, he said to himself. He tried his hardest to make himself believe that it wasn't singing and never had been singing, only roaring. Now, the trouble about trying to make yourself stupider than you are is you often succeed. Uncle Andrew did. He soon did hear nothing but roaring in Aslan's song. Soon he couldn't have heard anything else, even if he had wanted to. And when at last the lion spoke and said, "Narnia, awake," he didn't hear any words. He heard only a snarl. And when the beast spoke in answer, he heard only barking, howling, baying, growling, baying, and howling. Uncle Andrew, upon discovering himself to be an opponent of this new reality that he finds himself, he alters himself to best conform his perception of reality, that is his mind, to his wishes. While Uncle Andrew's predicament is at least a little bit comical, we receive a more sinister example in the person of Dr. Weston in the Space Trilogy. Dr. Weston, he's the primary antagonist in Out of the Silent Planet and in Perelandra. And when he finds himself arriving, he actually finds this demonic presence taking over. He becomes the unman, and he turns into a kind of spiritual vehicle whom the demonic uses for his own agenda. And at this point, what's interesting is Weston appears only intermittently as a voice escaping this possessed body that used to belong to him. Ransom, he recounts this, quote, "Worst of all were moments when it allowed Weston to come back into his own countenance. Then his voice, which was always Weston's voice, would begin a pitiful, hesitant mumbling. You be very careful, Ransom. I'm down in the bottom of a big black hole. No, I'm not. I'm on Paralandra. I can't think very well, but that doesn't matter. He does all my thinking for me. Ransom begins to reflect that perhaps hell is what one finds when one finds is in hell, what one finds is no longer human souls at all, but the husk of human souls with the insides consumed. Now, this is not to say that Wither and Weston were in every way no longer human, but it's not even to say that they were particularly bad kinds of humans. It is, however, to note that they were being consumed by a personality stronger than themselves, and in the process were becoming mere mechanism, near nothing. And Lewis recognizes that all humans follow the same temptation, right? Any individual who opens themselves up to consuming and consuming will ultimately be consumed, slowly but surely turning into nothing, a machine in which the individual is lost. Thus, in The Great Divorce, Lewis meets this heavenly George MacDonald who becomes his guide, and he tells him, hell is a state of mind. He never said a truer word. At every state of mind, left to itself, every shutting up of the creature within the dungeon of its own mind is, in the end, hell. But heaven is not a state of mind. Heaven is reality itself. All that is fully real is heavenly. And in the problem of pain, he goes on, I willingly believe that the damned are, in one sense, successful rebels to the end, that the doors of hell are locked on the inside. They enjoy forever the horrible freedom they have demanded and are therefore self-enslaved, just as the blessed forever submitting in obedience become, through all eternity, more and more free. And this leads us to our last question. What does it mean to engage with God as concrete reality? God is the eternal, substantive reality, draws creation close to itself, and when he does, in all of Lewis's books, creation appears to be changed. Dr. Ransom, in That Hideous Strength, for instance, it's the third book. He's this 50-year-old wounded philologist, and yet when Jane meets him for the first time, she notes that he appeared to be no older than 20, with fresh skin, a full beard, and immense strength. Through Ransom's trips into the heavens and his interaction with unfallen worlds and unfallen beings who are more teleologically aligned with the divine causal reality, his very body seems to have been altered. We see the same thing in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. As they approach Aslan's country in the utter east, we read this, no one ate or slept and no one wanted to, but they drew buckets of dazzling water from the sea, stronger than wine and somehow wetter, more liquid than ordinary water, and pledged one another silently in deep draughts of it. And one or two of the sailors who had been oldish men when the voyage began now grew younger every day. Alternatively, when we see children returning to Narnia after long times away, we see their strength coming back to them. In Prince Caspian, after 24 hours being back in the world, Edmund, Lewis says this, he's about to fight a dwarf, Trumpkin. And we hear this, I don't think Edmund would have had any chance if he fought Trumpkin 24 hours earlier, but the air of Narnia had been working upon him ever since they arrived on the island. And all his old battles came back to him, and his arms and fingers remembered their skill. The same thing with Eustace Scrubb in The Silver Chair. He returns after being returned, kind of redeemed in the first story. And while we read that any normal boy would have been exhausted by his ordeal on the first day, quote, he had been on great adventures in that world before, and the Narnian air was bringing back to him a strength he had won when he sailed the eastern seas with King Caspian. And what these examples hint at is that as one is brought closer to the true power in the universe, one becomes more physiologically and psychologically closer to, for lack of a better term, human actualization, right? All of our prior experiences are actually fulfilled, not lost, but fulfilled as we find our place with and in God. It appears that the physical and mental life of the universe, God, when engaged, shares itself in a way that humanity becomes all that it was ever intended to be by design. And this phenomena, while the imagery is in temporal settings, is ultimately eternal. In the last battle, the friends of Narnia, they've passed through death, and they're following Aslan's cry further up and further in. And as they begin to ascend into the new heights of the new Narnia, this heavenly realm, material creation itself becomes their subject. And the rules which once applied to them no longer do. They find themselves climbing up a waterfall as thousands of tons of water pour over it every second, and yet it's no problem for them, right? They find that they can see and touch and smell and taste in more profound ways than they'd ever imagine. And what's more and more is they find that their world was becoming larger. It was moving from smaller to larger, right? And they go into this walled garden where all this comes together. And we read the very first thing that struck everyone was that the place was far larger than it seemed from the outside. And here we find that even time is affected. We read about half an hour later, or it might have been half a 100 years later, for time there is not like time here. Lucy stood with Mr. Tumnus looking down over the wall of that garden and finding this strange expansion. She says to Tumnus, "I see now. The garden is like the stable." To which Tumnus responds, "Of course, daughter of Eve. The further up and the further in you go, the bigger everything gets. The inside is larger than the outside." And what Lewis is showing us is that in his world, God as the foundation of reality is larger than all our worlds, and he's contained by none. As one comes to know God more and more, so too does one come to know his creation, right? And vice versa. In these illustrations, we see expanding landscapes and expanding sensory capacities and expanding connection between people and places and even times. It's a meta landscape. As they move up into the mountains of Narnia, they find themselves actually connected not only with the kingdom of Aslan, that is the kingdom of God, but all of our other worlds, right? The right and pure England is there as well. He didn't mention the United States. It's probably there. But just for the record, all right? At the time, he did not find it fit to include that. All right? And so here's the thing. Why is this the case? Well, Lewis says in Miracles, Christ did not die for men because they were intrinsically worth dying for, but because he is intrinsically love and therefore loves infinitely. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis says that as Christians, we need to learn the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity, that therein there is something analogous to society, right? That the divine being from all eternity is love, not merely in the sense of being a platonic form of love, but because in him, quote, "the concrete reciprocities of love exist before all worlds and are thence derived to all creatures." Lewis calls God's plan for humanity from the beginning in the grand enterprise. He says a grand enterprise. He says to make an organism that is also a spirit, to take a poor primate, a beast with nerve endings all over it, a creature with a stomach that wants to be filled, a breeding animal that wants to mate, and say, "Go on with it, become a god." With this in mind, in the four loves, Lewis reminds us again of the purpose of nature. I want to bring us back. And the image of nature we all hold and why it's important. He says our real journey to God involves constantly turning our backs on her. That's nature. Passing from dawn-lit fields into some poky little church, or it might be going to work in an East End parish. But the love of her has been a valuable, and for some people, an indispensable initiation. In other words, we must look where God has presented himself in nature, in history, and ultimately in Christ. And part of the reason that we need to wrestle with why we need to reimagine reality is because for many, this is a gateway to seeing how God can even exist in our world and how he might be calling us to know him and interact with him still today. In Reflections of the Psalms, Lewis says, perhaps if man is finally to know the bodiless, timeless, transcendent ground of the whole universe, not as a mere philosophical abstraction, but as the Lord who, despite this transcendence, is not far from any of us, he must begin far more humbly and far nearer to home with the local altar, the traditional feast, and the treasured memories of God's judgments, promises, and mercies. I've only got a couple minutes left, and so I'm going to wrap up with this. I'm just a student still. Not that any of us ever arrives anywhere. But what I've been profoundly impacted by in Lewis is his ability to take our world, the way it comes to us, right? And what we see, taste, touch, smell, and hear, right? The experiences of beauty, truth, and goodness, the longings of the human heart, and repackage them in a way that sets, for many people, their hearts aflame, right? And I want to encourage you to wrestle. If you haven't read a lot of Lewis before, go back. Start reading. Read more. And I want you to think about this image, the image of God as the fountainhead of being pouring down, sharing himself with us and inviting us to know him more. Because I think it's consistent in Lewis. And I think through it, he wants us to ultimately see the cross and what Jesus did for us in the person of Aslan and everywhere else, and how we're invited to reimagine our world and how he's still with us now.